What we spoke last week is about the concept of karma and samsara, which karma, the concept of energy. What we said, karma, what's the translation of the word karma in Sanskrit? It is action, right? Work, action. Because it's the concept that every action of ours has a consequence. And we saw that in Jewish traditional ideas, and we focused on one specific author, which the name of him is Ramchal, Rabbi Luzzatto, out of the 18th century in Amsterdam and Venice. Great Kabbalist. He was one of the greatest Kabbalists of the later age. The same idea is mentioned. So if anybody has the handout, the one that says Derech Hashem is the way of God. Now, we are going to see a little passage of what he says. And the idea is eventually, and the class is finished, if people would like eventually to create a reading group that would take selected passages of this Rabbi Luzzatto. He wrote, as I told you, he lived for 40 years, right? He thought that he saw himself as the reincarnation of the great sage that lived in the 2nd century. His name was Rabbi Akiva. And the bottom line is he died because in the world says, the traditional world says that he came to rectify the 40 years that Rabbi Akiva was ignoramus. He didn't know anything. So he lived for 40 years, but he wrote a vast amount of books. His first book was, as I remember, the age of 17, a book on poetry called Lashon Limudin. And from then on, he was a prolific writer. For the next 23 years, he was very much persecuted by the Jewish community at that time. People did not understand him. They thought that he was Shabtai Tzvi. Does anybody know who Shabtai Tzvi was? He was the false Messiah that came in 1666. And he was also a great Kabbalist and became like this crazy Messiah that in the end converted to Islam. So they thought, okay, we have a second guy coming doing the same, this Rabbi Luzzatto. But the truth is he wasn't. He was probably greater than his generation. A lot of people didn't understand him. But the bottom line is that he wrote a vast amount of works. And the nice part of his works, as I told you, it's a path. And you'll see that the eightfold path in Buddhism that you have, which is the path of liberation, the path to nirvana, he wrote a book called The Path of the Just that works the exact same way, only in the Jewish take of the ideas that the Buddha was saying. In one school, this is a different school. But he wrote, and all his books are in the path. So you realize that the same ideas are brought deeper and deeper and deeper. So the first book that he wrote was called The Path of the Just. That is the most basic. The second most basic, which you're going to see, it's called The Way of God. So if you see on page 2, okay, the verse of page 1, it's item 2. Who would like to read? My accent is terrible, so I think you'll get a much better service if somebody else reads. Who else? Who would like to read passage 2? Please. Any volunteers? There's no grading here. Yes, what's your name?
Kate.
Kate, please. Okay.
Starting with the purpose?
God's wisdom.
God's wisdom, however, decrees that for such good to be perfect, the one enjoying it must be its master. He must be one who has earned it for himself, and not one given it accidentally or by chance.
Right. So this is his idea. The idea is that the reason why we live in the world that has karma is because we want to have a life that we have made it, that we didn't get it for granted, that we get to earn it. Okay? Now, so that was God. So God says, listen, as you see, God created the world for one purpose only, which is to bestow kindness to humans. And that kindness has to be able to be enjoyed, has to be deserved, has to be coming through merit. Now he goes to explain why. Okay, why merit is necessary. Who needs merit? Why can't you get it for nothing? So please, next paragraph, okay? One sees
that this arrangement is partially reminiscent of the perfection of God himself, at least to the degree that this is possible, for God's perfection is not a matter of chance either.
Right. So we have to be equal to God. And the way how we could make ourselves for us to be able to enjoy God, to bring some kind of a closeness, to cleave ourselves, to cleave to God, is only possible, that's not physical, is only possible by the laws of similitude, that we have to be similar to him. What is the most important thing that we know about him? that he is perfect, that he's not that by chance, but he is himself. He is the source of himself. So here for us to deserve and to earn and to enjoy anything is for us to actually earn it. Okay?
God, however, is the one true perfection, being inherently perfect, necessarily devoid of fault. This trait in truth is only God's, for no other being is perfect by necessity, devoid of fault by nature. Still, in order for a created being to come to resemble God to some degree, it is necessary that it at least earn perfection that not an inherent part of its being, and it must avoid the deficiency that is not included by its nature.
Clear? So this is the idea of zchut. Any questions, any thoughts? So this is the rule number one. God created humans to be able to earn, and the earning is the most important. As I told you, the worst thing that humans can have is to get something for nothing. That's why the verse in parable says, the one who despises, who hates gifts, can enjoy life. You can't enjoy life for getting something for nothing. Because this is the ultimate distance from the divine, is actually to have something that we don't deserve. Yes?
How does that concept of, my name is Danny.
Danny, hi.
Of needing to work kind of jive with, I guess what's, happening in Israel with a significant portion of the religious not working? You would think that they would, how does that play out?
It is a great question. You should know. Maimonides himself says that no one has to depend on anybody else, not for learning. Now, the rabbis, a lot of people believe that, listen, they are actually learning, and therefore they cannot get paid, supported as charity. They get supported as a stipend. When you look at a university, right? Any university, as we know, has a fellowship. So they look as the fellows of the Jewish people. Rightfully so, or wrongfully so, they are people who are devoting themselves to learn, so they see themselves as fellows. By the way, we have a great website, if you want to see that I was the one who helped, called yzfellows.com. And YZ Fellows, YZ represents the two letters, is Y and Z, represents two Jewish tribes. How many tribes did the Jewish people have? 12. 12 Jewish tribes. Two of them have a special significance. One of them was called Issachar, and the other one was called Zevulun. And you know what's interesting about these two tribes? One tribe devoted himself to learning, to just learn, and the other one devoted himself to physical matters, and he supported the guy learning. Because the world here, as we're going to see, the belief on this world, and the Buddha will say the same thing, the physical aspect of it is very devoid of meaning. Now the question is, you have to have a livelihood. So you always have to balance. So it's possible to create a partnership. That one is involved in spiritual matters, the other one is more involved into physical matters, and they could create a partnership. So this concept of the people learning is because they see themselves as partners of the Jewish people, but not as charity, but as a fellowship. Nothing worse than charity. You should know something. The worst a person can be is dependent upon others, because that's the ultimate distance from God. You should know this. Yes?
But wouldn't actually learning be considered work in and of itself? Like if anyone's ever tried to get to a page of Talmud or Gemara, it's a lot of work.
That's a very good point also. That's an excellent point also. That's a different form of learning. It's exactly right. And we in the world, we live in a world that you can never earn by yourself. You have always to earn as a partnership. By the way, this is also a Jewish idea that we can't explore today. But in life, God created the human that you can never earn on your own. You can never have, there's no human who could live in this world on his own. Because just as so many needs, there is a culture of exchange. And I'm going to I don't want to digress, but I'm going to bring you one very interesting concept. The power of money, right? The culture of money. We have a culture of money. And today, we all know fiat money. Everybody knows what's going on in the markets, right? All the concept of fiat money, that we have something that money doesn't really have any intrinsic value. Once upon a time, commerce was done by barter, right? Exchange. Today is done by money. What's the difference between money versus a barter economy? Does anybody know? Can give me what's the value of having a money economy versus a barter economy? Barter economy is that if I do X, I can exchange my X to somebody else. and I get a Y. Today we work, we get money, and money becomes the means of transaction. Yes?
Yeah, it's a common denominator.
So what's the value of it? Who needs that? Who needs a common denominator? That's exactly right. Of course, Bernanke, you have no job if you have a barter transaction. Okay, but if you believe that there's any real value in money, what's the value of money? Why the means of transaction, fiat money? Anybody can give me what?
You don't have to barter directly with someone. You can
So what's wrong? So what did this achieve? You're right. Convenience is just convenience. I'll tell you two thinkers on that. One of them is the Christian thinker, is a Jewish thinker, but he goes to say that this is the Christian way of life that came to create the American society. It's called Max Weber. And Weber says, you know what the value is? Because to create wealth, you need money. Because imagine, once I have money, I can invest anywhere. I can transact with anywhere. I can sell goods in China. Imagine if I only could barter what I make. If I have eggs, I have to find somebody who likes and needs eggs. And the guy is going to give me milk in exchange. The milk doesn't do anything. I have to look for somebody else. So that convenience makes the wealth is impossible. Imagine if I exchange my eggs to milk, I have to find somebody else who needs milk before the milk spoils. So you can't create wealth. That's one school of thought. There's a second school of thought called the school of thought of Karl Marx. You might have heard about Karl Marx, right? So Karl Marx says, you know what the value of money is? Because it allows to create a society. Because otherwise, if I have, let's say in the barter society, and I have eggs, I can only deal with people who want eggs. If somebody doesn't want eggs, it'll be very hard to deal with. The only way for me to deal with him is for if I exchange my eggs to milk, and this guy needs milk, I'll be able to talk to him. So it create a society. Money allows me to deal with anybody, to help anybody. It creates a society. This, in Hebrew ideas, is mentioned in the Bible. Esau sees the world as Rav, money as Rav, as multiplicity, as the idea of having a lot. And Yaakov, Jacob sees it as Kol, as creating a totality, a unit. That's the value of money. In life, that's the idea. To earn, we don't earn on ourselves. We earn collectively as a community. Jewish, this idea of the Ramchal, the Lutzato idea that you said that you have to earn, you don't earn on yourself. You earn as part of a society, the same way of money, right? That to create wealth, you create a society. So here, one guy learning is supported by somebody working. So together, they achieve perfection. So that idea creates this society that it's organic, that's all interconnected. That's the reason. Okay? Yes?
I don't want to get too sidetracked, but with regards to people working full-time, mostly in Israel, and learning full-time, I think it should be pointed out that that's a relatively modern phenomenon, and it's post-World War II, and the three yeshivas that were destroyed in Europe going back, that really wasn't the case. It was a much more smaller group of people. There's a lot of different I understand what you're trying to say. There's also a lot of sociological
Absolutely.
factors at play.
It's a phenomenon post-Second World War and post-State of Israel. Okay. But let's not digress. Okay, this is what we saw last week. Anybody who wants to continue, you have enough material to continue reading, but that's the basic idea. Now we're going to go into the next segment, which is the idea. As we spoke, the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And the enlightenment that he achieved is basically something called the Four Noble Truths. And today we're going to try, we saw last week the basic idea of the Four Noble Truths. Today we'll try to unpack these ideas and hopefully to see how in Jewish thought these ideas are thought out and expressed. Now, what are the Four Noble Truths? So this is a website that you have available on your courseworks or in Moodle. Here. Let's see, this is the traveling towards the Buddha. What is the first noble truth? The existence of impermanence. Nothing lasts forever. You remember, how did the Buddha get to this idea? Does anybody remember? How did he need, what brought him to need to come to enlightenment? The four sights. Does anybody remember what the four sights were? Yes?
He saw an old man.
Right.
He saw death.
And he saw a sick person, very good. And he saw somebody who's an ascetic, the Arhat. He saw the guy, so he realized that life, just the pleasures of this world, will come to an end. So who are we kidding? So the first noble truth is the existence of impermanence. And the impermanence is that life, no matter what, inevitably will lead to suffering. You could enjoy as much as you want, but realize that its joy will end up in suffering. And because the reason is because of impermanence, because nothing lasts forever. And what is the nature of suffering? Okay, I'm going to go back and we're going to see what is the concept of suffering. So you go to the introduction to Tibetan Buddhism that we brought before. What are the suffering of the Buddha? The first one is the suffering of misery, physical and mental suffering, the suffering of change. So the first is misery, which means misery that we suffer for the cravings of the things that we don't have. In life, you can't have it all, and there's a lot of frustration. So the frustration of misery, there is suffering in the fact that you can't get all that you want. I will tell you something more amazing. The Buddha says this, is suffering of misery. So what's misery? The fact that you don't have. But what happens if you do have everything? You look at a guy like Bill Gates. So it doesn't look like he has the suffering of misery. I don't think that. So where does the suffering of misery fall into place? The Talmud says the following idea. Ein adam met v'chatzi tavato beyado. Nobody is able to die fulfilling half of his desires. Okay? Soon see the second why. So you can never, doesn't matter how much you have, you want to want more. But there's an interesting passage. The passage in the Midrash says that yesh lo maneh rotze matayim. If somebody has 100, he wants 200. So in other words, the soul of the person is made that there is the insatisfaction, the lack of satisfaction is built into the person. So it doesn't matter how much you have. If you have 100, you want 200. So it doesn't matter if you have all the money in the world and all the girls of the world, you still want more. So that's suffering of misery. It doesn't matter how much you have. But you know, amazing, I just told you the Talmud says you never die fulfilling half of your desires. But the Midrash says if you want 100, if you have 100, how much you want? 200, so you always have half. Right? So what does it mean? The Talmud says you never die with a half. 100 is a half of 200. So this appears like a very clear contradiction. Any thoughts?
Right before you die, you want a lot.
But never, you never do it. You'll see that nobody will die with half. The Talmud says you never achieve half. And you know what they say, the commentaries? If you have 100, you want an extra 200. Because to have what you have more, to double what you have is worthless. So you won't have actually double what you have. So you're always left with a third. Right? You have 100, you want 200. So the Buddha says this is something called the suffering of misery. And you can't escape that. It doesn't matter how much you earn. You want to get a better job? Your better job is going to create, according to the Talmud passage, the more you have, the more you lack. Right? So we're going to soon say something very interesting. Yes?
We can't really classify as misery. I mean, that's kind of a strong word. I think it seems kind of convenient that this definition is being put underneath the umbrella.
You're right. It's right. But misery, what he means to say, because this is English translation from Sanskrit, the meaning is that you're lacking of, the lack of. That you suffer for not having. Because there's a second suffering, okay, which is the suffering of change. What is suffering of change? That in life, whatever you have won't last forever. It doesn't matter what you have, it won't last forever. And we're going to see something amazing. Even if you have something that lasts forever, you'll not be able to enjoy it forever. Can anybody tell me why? And I'll tell you a very interesting story. Again, I'm mixing now the two ideas. Methodologically, I should have given you the Buddha's ideas and the Jewish ideas, but they're so similar. Because the second suffering is the suffering of change. Now, the change is because if you have a car, the car will break one day. The car will get old. If you marry a beautiful girl or a beautiful husband, they'll age. Everybody ages. So there is this impermanence. But there is even a deeper impermanence. I'll tell you, this is a Jewish idea I'm going to tell you. Do you know what the difference is? Can anybody tell me what's the difference between luxury and necessities? Luxuries, necessities, the opposites of each other. Yes. Absolutely. Excellent. Luxury, you don't need. That's the name luxury says. Necessity is something that you need. But there is one more fundamental difference between the two. Yes.
Need to have versus need to have versus like to have.
Ah, excellent. And I'll just rephrase it. Need to have, you don't enjoy. You have because you need, but you don't enjoy. And luxuries is you like to have, you enjoy it. Let me give you an example. Breathing. There's no bigger necessity of breathing. Can anybody say that we enjoy the breathing every minute? Tell you stop breathing and you realize how important breathing is. But while you breathe, you don't even care, you don't even realize that you're breathing.
Or if you have a bad cold.
If you have a bad cold, that's exactly right. Then you are really starting. So you only appreciate when you don't have, or when it's difficult. But luxuries, you enjoy every moment. If you have a fancy car, you enjoy every moment. You don't need it. But you know the law of impermanence says the luxuries always will turn into necessities. Which means if you have a luxury, the luxury will lose its luster. You enjoy, and then you stop enjoying, but then not only you stop enjoying, they're depending on it. So luxuries will turn into necessities. In life, look at a refrigerator, right? A refrigerator is the greatest luxury 100 years ago. We can't live without a refrigerator. Do you enjoy having a fridge at home? You don't even think about it. Became a bare necessity. So the law of impermanence says not only you lose, the law of suffering says, okay, you suffer because you can't get everything that you have. But everything that you do get will lose its luster. And instead of you owning the thing will own you. Luxuries, you own and control the stuff. Necessities, they control you. This is the second suffering. Is the suffering of impermanence. And this is Jewish thought, and you're going to see how the Jews always thought this way. So the first one is, yes?
What about situations where the enjoyment comes from change? Where no change results in suffering?
It's exactly right. You'll see that is true. That also is something we're going to see. That's the third one that falls into the third category. But it is a very important thing. Sometimes the lack of change causes you suffering. But sometimes the problem is you need change, so you need constant stimulation. You need stimuli all the time to keep changing. That's why you enjoy the change, to a point that you're going to come the same thing. Number one, that you won't have the change, so you get bored to death. And sometimes the change is just too much. Always you fall into that trap. And that's the third one. The third one is the composition of suffering. The suffering endemic to cyclic existence. We go because what he says, the fact that you have and you are constantly caught into this cycle, that things go good and they go bad, that you end up dying, that you end up losing. This cyclical life, in itself, the Buddha believed of suffering. So the first noble truth is that life that we are created is in essence suffering. Lacking of, getting impermanence, that even what you have, and this cyclical all life, it's suffering. Yes?
Last week, Buddha was thinking of
Absolutely.
So, are these ideas from Hinduism as well?
No.
Translated
No.
from
This is what is called, in good English, the axial age of the Hindu tradition. The Hindu, again, I don't like using Hindu because Hindu, as we spoke last week, doesn't exist. The Vedas. The Vedas were not worried about this. At certain point in time, in 500 BC, people became very existentialistic. They started thinking about it. So he was a Buddhist that looks at the Vedas, says the Vedas doesn't help me. This is life, meaning I suffer, and all of life is suffering. How do I get out of this? And the Veda was very worried and very, they were very dedicated to ritual, to ritual this, ritual that, and all kinds of beliefs, and didn't change life. So the Buddha came to the conclusion that this is no good. So this is the idea. Now, the Hinduism, what we call the Vedas, also get transformed to this kind of existential questions. And what's the name of the seminal work, which is not work, but probably 700 or 800 works, a collection of lots of works. What's the name of that work? It's called the Upanishads. But this is the Veda doesn't deal with this. The Upanishads do deal with that. So, what is the first noble truth? The first noble truth is there is a truth of suffering. Now we're going to go back to the website. The first noble truth: nothing lasts forever. When you understand this, makes it easier not to be attached to what you're experiencing. Okay? So when you are experiencing something you think is bad, you can relax in the knowledge nothing bad lasts forever. So there is a flip side to all of this. If that is the case, so nothing can be bad forever either. But this, again, this is a website. But the Buddha, we are going to see, after we see the Four Noble Truths, the next exercise will be to read the Pali scriptures. How the Buddha says this in his own words. Because this is 21st century interpretations. We're going to take these ideas and to see what says in the Buddha's words itself in the Pali scriptures. Okay? First noble truth. Second noble truth. This is like the Manishtan, the 4 questions of Passover. Those are the 4 questions of the Buddha. The second one is, suffering arises because of craving. Desire, attachment creates suffering. The fact that we have desires, that desire is what creates suffering. I just told you, right? Because you need things that you can't achieve. And the more you have, the more you want. And once you have something, that desire tricks you. Because firstly, you get desire because you enjoy, and that becomes a necessity. So the second noble truth is, the reason why he's suffering, who is the cause, the root cause, is something called craving. It's something called desire. Second noble truth. So desire is bad, is the root cause of all suffering. So the Buddha says, know that there is suffering. You can't escape. But you could go ahead and look at the root cause of suffering, which is called craving, desire. Craving sensory stimulation, craving existence, craving not existence, desire is bad. So let's see how in Jewish law, in Jewish thought, this thing changes. Third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. The Buddha comes to, you see, what's good is a lot of people find a problem and then give you stuck and let you stuck without finding the answer. The Buddha, the first 2 noble truths are the problem, and the third noble truth is suffering can come to an end. It's not inevitable. It's inevitable to have suffering, but suffering you can get away from it. Third noble truth is the cessation of suffering, nirodha. So there is a cessation of suffering. And number 4, which is the most important, is how do you achieve that? And the 4th noble truth is the 8-fold path. The path to achieve the cessation of suffering. And how do you stop suffering according to the Buddha? Is stopping desire. You cut desire by its root, and you have no desire, no attachment. Now, it's not that you are detached, because detachment is a horrible word in English, but it's the non-attachment. That you don't have desire, that you make yourself desireless. And it's the 8-fold path. And we are going to explore the 8-fold path, hopefully next week. We're going to see how Jews approach. But the 4 noble truths, let's see how Jews approach and how Jewish thought thinks about it. But before that, what I would like to do is let's read the Pali scriptures. Not in Sanskrit, but in English. Okay? So you have the first discourse of the Buddha, in the Buddha's words. Okay? This is the first discourse. And we are going to start on page 76. Who would like to read? We start from the paragraph, second paragraph. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Anybody? So now you see, interpretation is great, but you always want to see the source before interpretation. This is in the Buddha's words. Now, this is interpreted, right, because it's in English. And the Buddha, as much enlightened as he was, I don't think he spoke English. So I think he spoke Sanskrit. So these are the Tibetan, the Sanskrit, original Sanskrit words of the Buddha. This is the beginning of Buddhism. Then there were so many other scriptures that are called the Pali scriptures. The Pali scriptures are the words of the Buddha before the first council. Anybody wants to read this? Yes? Volunteers? Yes, please. Okay, so the first one, now.
Now this month is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to being are suffering.
That's it. So this is the paragraph that describes. So what is suffering? Let's look at the Buddha. What does it say? Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Meaning doing what you don't want, what you don't enjoy, what you don't like is suffering. Second thing is illness is suffering and death is suffering. Right? He's talking about the three sides that he saw. So this is displeasing suffering. Now separation from what is pleasing is also suffering. Okay? So the third thing is first of all is getting things that you don't enjoy is suffering. Separating from what you have is suffering. And that's inevitable. You'll never be attached the same way. Right? Which you're going to see how these things are so interesting. Because once you know the truth of suffering, it's such an important thing. Because you realize that marriage, I'm married for 20 some odd years, 27 years. So if you say there's impermanence, and I just told you that you can't, so technically you hate your wife for a certain while. I mean, try to get one car for 27 years. You hate the car. Or you hate yourself driving that car. So how do you make marriage last? How does not that end up in suffering? Those are the questions. But once the Buddha says this, the impermanence, which means separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Separation because you don't have it, because it loses, or because you can't relate to it anymore. That's suffering. We're going to unpack the ideas later. Not to get what one wants is suffering. You can never get what you want. So that is the issue. In brief, the five aggregate subjects to clinging, meaning the five objects, which is debatable, but you could see those are the five senses. They are subject to suffering. Suffering is inevitable. Yes?
The first thing that's mentioned says birth is suffering. When you're born, you're basically born into, you don't own anything, you have no possessions, you have no attachment to anything. Other than
It's a great question. The Buddha will say the birth is suffering. Because the Buddha's view of the world, if you have such a negative view of the world, you're going to see, and that's such a great point. In Buddhism, the ultimate suffering is birth. Because birth is the cyclical existence of which is samsara, which is by nature suffering. To be the unborn life is a valley of misery. So as much as now what is so interesting, and that's just Americans, we have such a positive view of the Buddhism. You see the Dalai Lama, and they say like Buddhism, like you have life is great, and he's always smiling. But in Buddhist theory, as you see the first book of the Buddha, the ultimate first suffering is being born.
So is that a bad day?
It's the worst day. There's no birthdays. I don't think there is such a thing as birthdays in Buddhism. I think the birthdays and days of death. Because this,
It's the first traumatic experience you're going to go through.
Absolutely. You will see that in Jewish law is exactly the opposite. Jews are going to say, you will see that this truth of suffering, we're going to understand how we Jews believe in it. And I'm going to show you because this is this truth, noble truth number one. And nobody can ever tell you stories what Buddhism thinks because you're reading the Buddha's words. Okay, this is the Pali scriptures. Everybody knows that these are the Buddha's words. This is what the Buddha taught, and this is his first discourse. There's nothing before this. After the nirvana, this is his first discourse. The only thing is, if you want to know if this is exactly the meaning, learn Sanskrit and to read it. But this is a great scholarly translation, as close to it. Okay, and you'll see how we don't believe in this. Okay, yes.
It says, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering.
Right.
What about union with what is pleasing and separation from what is displeasing?
So the idea is very interesting. So what he's saying, the cyclical existence is always cyclical. So even if let's say if you get united with what's pleasing, in the end, you'll be disunited. So that is pleasing.
Fast forwarding all the pleasing stuff.
Absolutely. So he says impermanence. That's why the Buddha has this very, very, very negative view of life as it is, the cyclical life. So the Buddha is going to say that the cyclicality, and that's why I told you there's this cyclicality, the concept of the cyclical, that the Buddha thinks that cyclicality is suffering. You could always look at the cyclicality is not suffering, because since it's cyclical, nothing can be too bad, because in the end it'll get better. The Buddha says just the opposite. And now you could see his context. He's a prince. The tradition is that he lived with all the good. He only had to lose. If somebody, in other words, I always say, if you are very much in the bottom, cyclicality is great, because life can never get worse. But somebody who's on top, cyclicality is really bad, because nothing can, you're on top of it, right? If you look at Orson Welles, right? The War of the Worlds. The guy makes the best movie when he's like at a young age. So he knew that the path from now is downhill. So you are dead. So cyclicality is bad. So this is what the Buddha is. But this is the Buddha in his own words. Cyclicality is bad. Meaning, as much as people afterwards try to reinterpret and sugarcoat the words. Meaning, if you look at this, does anybody, I'm just going to ask you, if you look at Buddhism as it's sold as a pop culture, is it a positive or negative life? Meaning, is a positive attitude towards life or negative? Who thinks it's negative? It's always positive, right? We just saw the movie. Remember the movie that we saw from David Grubin? All these guys are in nirvana, like life is cool, life is great. Ain't so. Because this is the first truth of the first noble truth is life is suffering.
Well, I guess the positive is the optimism of the possibility.
The possibility to get out of life.
Right.
But only getting out. That's what he says. You'll see. You read the words. Let's not take away the pop culture, because you read, I know. Let's read the Pali's words himself, because you'll see. Second noble truth. So the first noble truth is pretty depressing. Second noble truth. Who wants to read the second noble truth? Otherwise, we're going to have to. Second noble truth. Anybody? Okay. Second noble truth.
Now this, monks, is a noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and craving for extermination.
Right. The root source is craving, desire. But interestingly enough, says the Buddha, every desire counts as the root for suffering. What is it? Delight in lust, the here and there, craving for sensual and pleasures, craving for existence. Right? All humans, every living being craves for existence. Nobody wants to die. That craving, says the Buddha, is the source of suffering. That's right, because you have to cling for life, so you have to go through all kinds of different things. But craving for extermination is also a craving. So in other words, you are basically stuck. You can't crave to live. Basically, you can't crave for anything, because every craving brings suffering. Second noble truth. Okay? Now we're going to decide, and afterwards I want to show you in every single of these noble truths, what does Judaism believe? And you'll see why. And it's such a different take in life. Okay? Third noble truth. Anybody? Cessation of suffering. Now it's at least, this is the problem. But what we spoke, the Buddha does have a light at the end of the rainbow. So, yes.
Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, not attachment.
So this, he says, the only way to avoid suffering is getting away of desires, of cravings. How do you do that? So the Buddha looks at this is hard stuff, meaning you have to read very carefully. So he says, the relinquishment of it, you have to give up craving. Then, if you give up, if you're ready to give up, you have the freedom from it. And then you achieve the non-attachment. That even you have the pleasure, you don't attach, you don't depend on it. Since suffering is caused by craving, you've got to tame and take away craving. First, giving it up, right? Very clear, which is a relinquishment, freedom, and non-attachment. And ultimately is how do you achieve that? Anybody? Just the last one. Now this monks. Anybody? Yes.
Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path that is right view, right concentration.
Right view, right concentration. They're skipping the 8 because you see there are 8 steps to achieve that. So he's going to show you that the relinquishment of desire, right? The lack of attachment of desire is achieved through 8 steps, which the last one is the right concentration, which is called meditation. Okay? And this is it. This is the summary of the Buddha's words. And if you have the rest of it, if anybody wants to have the rest of the first discourse, it's just reiterating the same ideas. And now we have to unpack these ideas and to see what and how we Jews think about this. Okay? The truth of suffering. Is the world suffering? So let's look at Rabbi Luzzatto at the beginning of his other work called The Path of the Just. His 8-fold path book, which is more than 8, you see, that we're going to be, starts with the same truth of the Buddha for some reason, but that's what it starts. Okay, let's go see it. The Path of the Just, the last one. And hopefully we'll be able to explore as much as we can. We don't have much time, that's the problem. Okay, our sages, second paragraph. Now, let's go for the first paragraph. Who wants to start the reading? I'm sorry for getting the reading, but I think that you can only learn things when you see them inside, because people can sell you anything. The words of the Buddha, it's very easy to give you and to sugarcoat life. Life is not sugarcoated. You've got to see it inside, right? Seeing is believing. So let's read it, what it says. Anybody? Guys? Anybody? Guys, girls? Anybody? Okay. You, please.
The foundation of all piety and the root of complete divine service is that a person comprehend the true nature of his duty in life and the aim and objective he must adopt in all matters as long as he lives.
You have to know the goal. You can't have a plan without knowing the goal, right? So what's the goal? Our sages,
may their memory be blessed, have taught us that man was created solely to delight in God and take pleasure in the splendor of the Shekinah.
so we were created for what? For delight. And to delight in God and pleasure in the splendor of the Shekinah. Yes.
For that is the true delight and the greatest delectation that can possibly be.
So we were created for pleasure. That's the objective of people, is we are created of pleasure. Now the pleasure is with God and the Shekinah. But why? Because that is the ultimate pleasure. But the world was created for pleasure. So if that is the objective of the world, why is there so much suffering out there? And why isn't the Buddha right? Suffering is you can never achieve what you're looking for, number one. Whatever you achieve is impermanent. And you have always these cyclical ideas that no matter how good it is, you know that it's going to turn bad. So if this is created to pleasure, why is there so much suffering? And why isn't the Buddha right? Anybody? Thoughts? Yes? Tell me. They do. And not only that, but I think the Buddha is right. Why is there pleasure? Where is the pleasure? Yes. And why, if there is pleasure, why so much suffering? Yes.
I have 2 points. One is that I don't know if necessarily you're saying the opposite. I think, in the sense that
Good point.
I've kind of read about this.
Tell me.
But I think he would say that ultimately, at least in a psychological sense, his purpose is also to
Achieve pleasure.
Suffering, which in a sense is achieving pleasure.
Very good. So it's very possible that they're not arguing. That all of them agree that the goal is pleasure. But there is the path that leads to pleasure is suffering. And you've got to find the right path. Very possible that that's what Ramchal is saying. That is a very, very deep understanding. It's very possible. But the question is, why is the path to pleasure made out of suffering? The question of the Buddha, that life is suffering, and you've got to take care of the suffering to achieve pleasure. Why is there such a thing?
Why is suffering the foundation?
Why is the foundation? Why the path to pleasure is through suffering? That's the first noble truth. In other words, and the Buddha says very clearly, you look at the Pali, before achieving pleasure, you have to acknowledge the life is suffering. If you don't acknowledge the life is suffering, you'll never be able to achieve the pleasure. Why did God create? If we believe God created the world, why is that true? And is that true? Is that a world of suffering that leads, and they're saying the same thing? And I do believe that they're saying the same thing. They're not opposites, they're exactly the same thing. In this aspect, we agree. And the question is why? The Buddha says that's what it is. Like they say in Hebrew, zemayesh. That's what it is, right? The laws of life. We want to understand, why did God create the world in such a way? Yes?
I would say that you could argue that to understand and recognize pleasure, you have to experience suffering. So without seeing the two, there's always something in the middle, but in order to get the two extremes, they separate equally.
In other words, that for you to be able to appreciate something, you have to see the opposites. It's called negative identity.
Yes.
Good point, yes.
It seems that in all this, to get to the pleasure, the things that are required seem to be against your nature. To not want, to have this non-attachment is against our nature. So you sort of going against your nature usually requires a lot of work, which is suffering.
Why God created such a thing? The first of the pleasure has to be against our nature. Great question. But it is true. Even the Buddha is saying the natural path is the cyclical path. You got to get out and you have to be mental. You have to say that's a great question. Why? Yes.
Just to go back to that point, that Luzada said before, that you have to work and earn something. So by overcoming the suffering, you reach the pleasure by working through it.
Absolutely. This is exactly fits with this picture. For you to be able to earn it, you have to go against your nature. Because then you are coming to say, God created us faulty and missing. And that pleasure has to be earned. That's what just said. That's why it's against our nature. Because otherwise, the pleasure that we are getting is something that He gave us. We have to create a reality that the pleasure is self-made, is a self-creation. Yes?
It wouldn't necessarily even be pleasure if it was given to you.
Exactly right. Because you can't, it becomes the ultimate suffering. As you'll see, it's exactly right. Something that, so it's not, now I'm going to tell you something, I want to see the depth of the thought. It's not that suffering is innate to us. In other words, that whatever is innate to us leads to suffering. It appears to be that what's innate to us leads to suffering. But just the opposite. Because it's innate to us, it's suffering. Because innate means for granted. You're born with it. So what we argue with the Buddha is the birth is suffering. Birth is suffering, but the rebirth is pleasure. So in other words, not because something is natural to us, we have like some kind of a natural tendency to enjoy things which are harmful to us. Because the idea is, because it's natural to us, it's harmful. Because something natural means that we created, we have made it. So that in itself is harmful. So it's not that what's natural to us, God created us with bad addiction. That's not what it is. God created us telling us that whatever is created, whatever is given, birth is suffering. Means that what I created you faulty. You have the chance to bring pleasure. So the reason why suffering is innate to us, because whatever is innate to us by nature is suffering. Pleasure can never be like that. So this is a different take on the same ideas of the Buddha. So the first noble truth is true. We believe in it 100%. But this is the goal of life. The goal of life is to achieve the rebirth. what we argue very much so, and I want to tell you, is the second noble truth. And this, people, is something that you have to remember. We're going to keep you 10 extra minutes just to go to the second noble truth, because this can change your life, and that's extremely important. So the first noble truth, life is suffering, is true, because innate is suffering, because once it's innate, it's not mine, it's not pleasurable, because the only pleasure if it's self-made. So by nature, birth has to be suffering. Second noble truth. What was the second noble truth? What creates suffering? Cravings and desires. Which means the Buddha will say all desires are bad. As we know that. The desire for pleasure, what is it? The desire for sensual pleasure. The desire for existence. The desire for non-existence. All desire is problematic. And all of the eightfold path will be to eliminate desire. Do we as Jews believe in that? Who thinks yes? Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. It's not loaded, not getting any grades. Does anybody believe in this? Why not? And why isn't it right? And you soon see something that I want to show you because it's extremely important. Because this defines us as Jews, right? Because as you'll see, the will, volition, is the beginning of the human being, according to our sages. Okay? I'm going to bring the idea because we are late, and I want to show you something interesting. Okay, let's close this, and let's go to the next document. No. Nefesh. And you have it on your handout. This here, it's an acronym called the Neran Chai. Neran Chai in Hebrew is 5 letters, 5 Hebrew letters. The Nun, the Reish, the Nun, the Chet, and the Yud. The Neran Chai are the 5 levels of consciousness of the soul. The soul, as you'll see, has 5 levels. This 5-level existence is all over the place. If you remember, if anybody was in the science course that we spoke, how many worlds of consciousness in the Kabbalistic wisdom there are? How many worlds of 5 worlds? The soul, the consciousness of the soul, is divided into 5 levels. The 5 levels come from the following. God's name, how many letters does he have? The Tetragrammaton. How many letters? Tetragrammaton, 4. However, the Yud has, besides the letter, it has a little line, a little crown above it, which is the number 5. Those are the 5 levels of the consciousness. Our souls and our consciousness, if you go and you get to know yourself, you realize that there are 5 levels of your own consciousness. The travel inwards is the most fascinating travel. And that is the goal of Jewish life, is to arise your deeper sense of the soul. What are the 5 levels of the soul? The 5 levels of the soul are here. The first one is called the nefesh. Does anybody know what the nefesh is? Yes.
Kind of like your animalistic soul. It's the part of your soul that wants things like food and shelter.
Physical. That relates to the physical. Is the physical desires and lust. Excellent. Nefesh. Animals have nefesh. Nefesh is the part of the soul which is very, very physical. There is a higher level which is called the ruach. The ruach in Hebrew, you know what ruach means in Hebrew? Wind. What is that? That is the metaphysical portion, which is the physical and non-physical. And we're going to teach you today, however, if we have a couple minutes, how to identify that. How do you know that? How do you get to that? How do you rise that portion of the soul? Metaphysical, physical and non-physical. Can anybody show me something which is physical and non-physical at the same time? Metaphysical. One example. Guys, it's your soul. Everybody has this. You just have to get to know yourself. let's say money. There's a physical pleasure of money. Money gets you buy fancy cars, fancy clothing, fancy homes. But a guy like Bill Gates, after you have your first $1 billion, you have to really be creative to spend $1 billion in your lifetime. Meaning even Imelda Marcus had like 400 pairs of shoes. But God created us with only one pair of feet. I mean, so you don't have to get 400 pairs of shoes. Yeah, okay, and how much you're spending already? Right? How much you go? $1 billion to spend, it's possible. But it takes a heck of a lot of time. You buy a very fancy home for $100 million. Okay, but how many homes can you have? You're only one person. How many steaks can you eat? So what drives you to get the next billion and then the 4 billion and get to the 50 billion? Now I remember talking to, we had a thinking group, beginning Bankers Trust, with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, those two guys. And we're thinking about what's the purpose of money. And they always held that the money will be given away. We are making the money to give back to society from day one. So why make the money? Why don't you enjoy life and play golf for the rest of your life? Huh? Which is a metaphysical. It's a pleasure of something, the success is measure of something physical and making money and getting a bigger bank account, but is metaphysical. Achievement. That is a metaphysical pleasure. We'll soon see in a second how that goes. And that comes from the consciousness of Ruach.
Would you include any kind of social approval?
We're going to see. We're going to learn. These things, guys, there's no definition set in stone. I want you guys to one day to experience your soul because you see the different traits, because they will see. The next one is the neshama. The neshama is the highest spiritual form, which is all spiritual of the soul. And that's cognitive. You could experience, it's tangible, you could experience spirituality. We'll soon see what experience spirituality is, because it's very easy to fool yourself. To have emotions, to go to Kumzit, it's not experiencing spirituality. Pop culture is not experiencing spirituality. Madonna's Kabbalah is not experiencing Kabbalah. We'll soon see what it means. And then we have 2 more levels which are not experienced. It's extremely difficult to reach them. And by the way, the Buddha, the later schools of the Buddha, the school of the Tantra, has searched that you have in yourself this level of consciousness that you'll soon see that in the end they came to believe that's called the Chaya, which is they call the indestructible drop in Tantra lore, the indestructible core. And that is something very strong that you want to cherish it. The non-attachment, this whole idea of non-existence is to a point. And Chaya is that core of the soul. Because if we think, who are we? We always say in the prayers in the morning, God, the neshama that you gave me. Who is the me? We are saying to God, the neshama that you gave me. Who is the me that precedes the neshama? So the great sage of Vilna, the Gaon of Vilna says, is this Chaya. Chaya is the core soul. You can only understand it when you go into meditative states in prayer. And that's what we say in the prayers. God, the neshama that you gave me, gave to the Chaya, tehorahi. It's pure. That is the indestructible, pure soul that we have. And finally, there is Yechida. You know what the word Yechida means in Hebrew? Chaya, what does Chaya mean in Hebrew? Life, the provider of life. Okay, this is the source of life. And Yechida, single. This is the point of connection to God. This is where the soul connects and clings to God. Very few people ever reach that level. That they could see where the soul and God create a mystical union. And that is the name of God, the 4 letters. There is a crown. The crown which transcends the letters is the Yechida. You know what our sages say? Will and volition are valid, depends where it comes from. So what the Buddha says, that all desire leads to suffering. It's not true. Desire, it depends what desire is coming from. you see the desire from the nefesh is different than the desire from the neshama and the ruach and the chaya. And in life, you have to connect to the right desire and relinquish the wrong desire. So we qualify the second truth of the Buddha. What the Buddha says, impermanence. Know what our sages say? Look at how beautiful our sages say the same idea. The word nefesh in Hebrew means soul. Which soul is the nefesh? Does anybody remember? What soul is the nefesh? The physical soul, lust, desire. The word nefesh in Hebrew also means desire. Im yeshet nafshechem. The word in Hebrew, if you look at the Bible, if you know Hebrew, you know the word nefesh means soul, but means desire. EFC betakarat chachamim. Throughout. Anybody who knows Hebrew knows that nefesh is desire. Nefesh is equals to ratzon. Nefesh is equals to desire. Now, interestingly enough, in Hebrew, the word ratzon, desire, is the same shoresh, is the same root as the word to run, ratz. Why? Because desire is the engine that motivates the world. If you don't desire, you don't do anything. What makes you go is desire. So desire means run. So the word nefesh means also, not only it means desire, means run. That's one sense of the word nefesh. But the word nefesh in Hebrew has an opposite meaning also. The word nefesh also means to rest. Shabbat vayi nafash. Omed lafush. Nefesh means to rest. So nefesh has this contradictory meaning. It means to run, it means desire, and it means to rest. Why is that? Why does the nefesh have this crazy thing? It means to run, and it means to rest. Why? Do you know why? Huh?
It can move you both ways.
Good, but even more. It's not only move both ways.
Desire, the physical and desiring things can motivate you to do things.
Absolutely.
Can hold you back from doing a lot.
That's absolutely right. That's a great point, but it's even more. Now that we saw the first Buddha of the truth of the Buddha, we know what that sages say. It's not that you can lead either or. Always will do both. The nefesh is not a wave which is straight up. It's always every desire of the nefesh will make you go until it satiates and it stops. Is the law of impermanence, is the nefesh. Physical always will be a desire that in the end is impermanent. It's a desire that leads you to do it but brings frustration. That juggle. You remember the world was created in a scale. I told you that's how the Kabbalists always say the world is a scale. The nefesh has a scale. Is desire to run, frustration. If you love, let's say, ice cream, you could have a desire to eat ice cream. I guarantee you, if you get the ice cream and you eat enough of it, you'll get sick and you'll never be able to see ice cream again. Life is impermanence. So what the Buddha said, the second truth, which is that desire is a function of suffering. Suffering is a function of desiring, is true. Because the desire of the nefesh is that. You know what the ruach means? Ruach is wind in movement. The definition of wind is air in movement. So it means there's a constancy that's forever. The big difference, the demarcation point between the nefesh and the ruach is impermanence. Every desire which is physical is impermanent. Every desire which is metaphysical by already starts being forever. The impermanence law of the Buddha doesn't apply anymore. Can I give you a typical example? Money. If you have a guy who works to have pleasure, to go and buy cars, nice clothing, I have workers. You know the first thing they need? It's called vacation. When you hire a guy, you have always vacation. How many weeks vacation you have? If you don't give him a vacation, you know what happens? The guy burns out. Law of impermanence. You can't work forever. You know what's the difference between him and Bill Gates? Bill Gates doesn't need the physical pleasure of money, Not only Bill Gates doesn't need a vacation, Bill Gates can take a vacation. People who have a lot of money, not they don't need a vacation, they can't even take a vacation. It's their life. The bigger achievers whose money became metaphysical is because it's permanent. They can't even get out of it. This is what this real reality of life. I told you, marry a wife. Try to get a car and drive the car for 25 years. I guarantee you, bless you, if anybody drives a car for 25 years, either you hate the car or you hate yourself, that you're still stuck in this 25-year-old car. And you marry your wife and you grow old with her. How the heck can you ever expect this thing to work? See, no wonder that in America you have more than 50% divorce. Because meaning we change clothing every year, meaning if you ever see a tie is wide for 5 years and then it gets narrow, right? You have always this impermanence. How can you expect to have marry and they live happily ever after? You're right. If it's physical, you love your wife because of the physical, I guarantee you that you, doesn't matter how pretty and how attractive she is, you look at People magazine and you see that these guys get bored of their wives 2 years later. Boredom fits it. But one is not physical, it's metaphysical. Love is metaphysical. By nature, not only doesn't satiate, the laws of the Buddha don't apply, by law it will always grow. And that's how you know if something is physical and something is not physical. So the more inner of your soul, the desire is more pure. Now, ruach is not a pure desire because it's still metaphysical. The neshama has more. The chaya, anybody who's in touch, realizes that that is the greatest pleasure of all. So suffering is impermanence. The more physical you are, the more impermanent you are. So the law, second law of the Buddha is, and by the way, the later scriptures and the later traditions of the Buddha reinterpret the Buddha to say that not all desire is no good. Comes to the same idea. So desire has a value. And therefore, the path of the number 3 of the Noble Truth is the truth that suffering can come to an end. By the cessation of desire is by the cessation of improper desire and the search for the proper desire. The difference between us and the Buddha, we will never try to quiet down the right desires. Our meditation and our approach is to quiet down the desire which is physical and to arise the right desire, which is the motivation force of the world that can lead us to a really happy life. And next week, we're going to see how the Buddha tried to achieve that and how we try to achieve that. If you have any questions, please feel free to write an email and look at the materials at the website, and hopefully you enjoy. Have a good night.